Hello and welcome back. In today's video we are taking a look at another Bannerlord blog, which is to do with the map design in specifically castles. Now I know I've only been doing Bannerlord blogs over the past few weeks. Now I've kind of been doing them weekly, and that's because I got a lot of stuff in real life that I've got to sort out, and that's kind of why I was away for so long. So I'm doing videos every now and again, but I'm slowly going to be introducing some more Warband mod spotlights, because there's some really cool stuff coming out on there, especially a new Persistent World mod. That is something to look forward to, as well as some Hearts of Iron content that I've been wanting to put out for months now, but just have never got around to it. Anyway, let's jump into this week's blog. Today, it says, in this week's blog, we would like to discuss the thought process that goes into designing castles for the game, from the historical influences we use to the gameplay-related decisions we make, and show you how all of this comes together to create a castle for the game. Now, obviously, that point of actually incorporating realism from historical sources and making the gameplay actually balanced is so important. We see throughout numerous mods in Warband where the castles were either really biased in terms of for the defenders or the attackers, but we did see a lot of balanced maps as well, and that's what they're trying to reach as in multiplayer and single player. But people get most annoyed, I think, when in single player, when a castle's just impossible to take with no matter what you do, or in multiplayer when it's the same thing but there's a lot more people playing, and people get really annoyed when there are certain parts of a castle that are too overpowered, for example. So the first subheading reads historical influences. It says, in our faction overview blogs, we talked about the cultures and peoples that influenced the design of each of the factions of Calradia, and how this provided us with a solid base to build on and create our own take on this period of history, because obviously Bannerlord isn't real history, it's their own kind of lore, but they're taking inspiration from Celtic tribes with Britannia, I think it is, and obviously the Nords with the... Look at me using Warband references. I mean, the Vikings with the Sturgeons, for example. It says, using real-world cultures in this way gives us the advantage of having a wealth of historical source and knowledge to take inspiration from, and allows us to cherry-pick the parts which we find interesting and exciting to include in the game. This kind of readily available information is extremely useful when it comes to designing architecture for the game, in particular, castles. It continues to read, for most of our factions, this process is quite straightforward. After all, there are many medieval castles that are still standing and in use to this day. However, when it comes to a faction like Britannia, which draws inspiration from the native tribes of the British Isles, things start to get a little bit more complicated. Just a side note, if you haven't seen Warwick Castle in the UK, that is an absolutely amazing castle. Give it a Google search. It's just... I'd love to see a castle that's designed like that in Bannerlord. I'm sure we will, but yeah, that's just something that I really like. It carries on to say, the British Isles were subject to many waves of invaders and settlers over the years, each bringing their own advancements in architecture and warfare with them. The arrival of these various cultures where their different building methods solely superseded the traditional earthwork and wooden defensive structures of the Celts and the Picts. Right by where I live is a Celtish hill fort, which is really cool. It's got lots of different rings that are very, very tall, considering how old it is. So yeah, I have one that's really local to me, so this is particularly interesting, and hopefully we could see that kind of thing from the Britannians. It continues to say, this presented us with a choice. Do we closely follow the design of the original structures, or do we take inspiration from the designs which followed? It continues to say, in the end, we decided to make use of the beautiful extensive hill forts and massive earthwork ramparts from Iron Age Britain, while trying to stay away from the Norman influences on castle building, which they actually used for the Valandian faction, I think. We include features like multiple rows of ditches and earthwork defences, while trying to keep the circular forms of the original earthwork with each upgrade level of the castle. Now that particularly makes me excited just because of how much history that kind of castle has in my life, especially considering I live right next to one, and also it's just a very cool type of castle, because you're going to be able to upgrade it, maybe to have maybe even a little keep at the top, but you're going to have these rows of rings with ditches, and obviously you're going to be able to put your men up on there, maybe put a palisade wall, and it talks about castle upgrading, which is also very interesting, because it looks like we're going to be able to upgrade castles from like a base version to maybe a more extensive and better defensible, I think that's a word, castle. The article continues to say, this thought process carries over to all of our factions. We tried to stay true to our original designs to make each castle believable enough as to not break the immersion of the player, but still leave enough room for us to inject some of our own ideas and style into each castle. So they've definitely taken all their historical influences from the Celts, the Vikings, all the Saxons and that kind of thing, and they've incorporated their own lore and their own style to those actual realistic historical groups, and have made their own type of castles that stick to the historical basis of those groups. The next subheading is to do with the upgrade system, and that's something I mentioned earlier, so I was kind of jumping ahead of myself just a little bit. And it says the castle upgrade system in Bannerlord allows us to have a greater variety in our castle designs. Apart from the additional depth to the campaign that this system brings, we try to use it to create different experiences for the player when attacking or defending a castle. The system is quite simple. Castles start at level 1 and can be upgraded twice to reach their maximum level. With the example on screen, you can see with each upgrade the castle gets taller, more dominant towers, better positions to deploy defensive machines such as ballista and onagers as we saw in the previous devlog. There's also deeper walls at critical points for larger troop formations, greater coverage over its gatehouse, and the opportunity to deploy a layered defense. So there's a lot of depth in this particular design of castle. You can see how much it changes. You can see the development of even interior buildings such as like little farm village buildings. So depending what you have maybe in those village buildings might make you have better defensive weapons. Maybe it can produce more onagers, maybe if they get destroyed, something like that. Obviously they're going to have some sort of effect, otherwise there's no point in them being added. These castle walls, again, as they get built up, you can see that they just get more crenellations, they get taller, and overall the castle just becomes a lot better. Now, I'm not sure what the actual cost of this is, whether you have to get materials or something, or you have to buy them off villagers like you did in the previous game. It might actually add a use for things like wood. I'm not really sure, but we'll have to see. Maybe it will mention it in a later point in this blog. So it says, while it may be acceptable or even preferable in some instances to assault the gatehouse of each level 1 castle with just a battering ram, as the castle is upgraded, this kind of simplistic approach becomes less viable, and by level 3 you will need a well-coordinated attack to be able to breach the defenses. Now this is very interesting, so I assume that maybe a king's castle is going to be maybe starting off the game at a level 2 or maybe even a level 3 depending on the faction. Or all castles might start at level 1, and as you progress through the single player, these castles are going to develop. And if you siege the same castle once, maybe in 1 year, and then in the next year you siege the castle again, you might be facing yourself with a completely different task, and you're going to have to use a completely different tactic just because of how much the castle has changed. Callum, the writer of the devblog, goes on to say, however, with that being said, this might not necessarily be the case in every instance. A castle placed on top of a hilltop or a plain might grow stronger in more than one way, with each upgrade, while one that incorporates some of the natural defense such as a lake won't have the room to expand and will only receive the benefit of taller towers and walls with each upgrade. So if you have a lake, I'm not sure if a moat would be included maybe with the defensive upgrades. I think a moat would be able to be upgraded because it's not really a natural barrier unless you've built it by a river or something, but the actual incorporation of having things like lakes or maybe even forests very close to a castle, that is very, very interesting. Maybe if you build your castle near a natural barrier, especially around mountains or something, that might mean that you might not be able to expand your castle as much, but you'll be able to build it taller. You might have a more natural defensive position compared to your counterparts. That's something really cool, and because obviously you're building castles, we saw a long time ago, you actually get to build your own castles in this, and I think you decide where you build them as well, but I'm not entirely 100% on that. But this could be interesting, especially with these natural benefits that you can gain from placing your castle in a particular place. The last section of this devlog is to do with the gameplay, and it reads, as far as playing styles go, Mount and Blade games offer our players a number of different ways to approach battles. In Sieges we can simplify this a little and look at its two main styles. You are commanding your army to its maximum potential from the rear, or you are fighting on the front lines and creating opportunities for your troops to exploit, whether that's you personally going in there because obviously the player is going to be a lot better than the AI, depending on what your difficulty you're playing on. Maybe you could bash a hole in a shield wall or push the what's it called, siege engine towards the wall yourself, maybe incorporating other people on your team obviously to do that, and that's how you're going to be exploiting the opportunities, especially as the player. Rather than managing soldiers. It also goes on to say, in Bannerlord, we want players to be able to experiment and choose their own way to approach sieges, and this is something we take into consideration when designing castles. The last paragraph says, no matter how large or complex our castles are, we try to give commanding positions for both the attackers and defenders. A small hill near your siege camp or the tallest tower in your castle may not be the best position to utilize your character's combat potential, but it would give you a great vantage point to oversee the battle from and make it easier to command your troops. I think that would be so cool if you had like a big, I don't know, rampart, because back in the day, in medieval times, for example, they actually used to build defensive like earthworks almost for the attackers, so they could kind of get a vantage point, or even kind of defend their own troops from incoming projectiles from the castle. I think sometimes, I can't remember when it was, I think I can't give you an absolute example. They used to actually build these huge earth banks that would actually all go all the way up onto the castle walls, and then they'd climb up these earth banks and attack that way instead of using siege towers and things like that. And this means that it would be a lot harder to destroy, and the defenders would actually have to come out and blow this kind of earth embankment up. I think the Romans used it, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm not the greatest historian in the world, but that would be so cool to see in Bannerlord, because the amount of thinking that you'd have to go into actually destroying that and making that, and that would actually prolong the siege quite a lot. But I don't think we'd see that. Maybe we could ask for it and we could get it in a DLC later on or something. Who knows? But yeah, I really like that idea of you being able to oversee the battle from a high vantage point, whether that's a tower or an embankment, because you can see your whole army spread out and you can order them where you'd like, especially as we're probably getting around maximum 1,000 characters on one battle, which is really cool. So you'll be able to see a huge battle taking place, and this is something that I've pretty much wanted from childhood, just to be able to do this, and I found that on Warband, but this is just taking it a step further. So guys, that is pretty much it for today's blog. It's quite interesting to see the little animation to do with how the castles are going to be upgraded. We're not really sure how you upgrade them, whether that's just a progressive thing over time, or you're going to have to put particular resources or money, for example. It's probably going to be a paid thing, where, not real money, but when you pay dinars in order to upgrade your castle. So I hope you did enjoy this blog. A lot of people actually did enjoy this, looking at the comments down below, and I hope you did enjoy this also. So guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an absolutely brilliant day, and I will see you in the next battle.
Sing the song for a broken hearted.